It's a great tradition to hear from the Dean reunion weekend, and we're so pleased, thrilled actually, to have Dean Gillian Lester here with Tony Blinken, class of '88. My job is to do brief introductions, so I will begin. Gillian Lester is the Lucy G. Moses Professor of Law and 15th Dean of Columbia Law School. She is a nationally recognized authority on employment law and policy, and she's the author of numerous books and articles and co-authors one of the leading case books on employment law. Dean Lester is in her fourth year as Dean of Columbia Law School, and prior to joining us was a member of Berkeley Law's faculty, where she served as Vice Dean and as Acting Dean. Dean Lester has held external appointments at Harvard Law as a Sidley Austin Visiting Professor, and at Georgetown Law as a Visiting Professor and Sloan Fellow, and has had visiting appointments at USC Gould School of Law, University of Chicago Law School, Radzyner School of Law in Israel. Dean Lester holds degrees from Stanford Law and the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, where she served as editor-in-chief of the Law Review. I want to add that since Dean Lester started, just now close to 3.5 years ago, she's traveled the world from Sao Paulo to Shanghai, and reaching out to our alumni and engaging you and getting you to encourage you to come back to campus. So we're so proud that so many of you are back here today. As head of development, I also wanted to mention that Dean Lester led us to a record fundraising year last year for 2017, which is tremendous. Thank you, Vaughn, which is tremendous. But and I'd also say with thanks to all of your support, it looks like we will set another record for 2018. So I just had to say that, being head of development and alumni relations. But Dean Lester is in conversation with Tony Blinken, class of 1988. I want to quickly give you a bio on Tony if you don't know Tony. He's currently the managing director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. And prior to helping lead the Biden Center, he served as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State from 2015 to 2017, during which he traveled to 40 countries, helping lead diplomacy in the fight against ISIL, the rebalance to Asia, and global refugee crisis. Prior to serving as the country's #2 diplomat, Tony served as Principal Deputy National Secretary Advisor to President Barack Obama from 2013 to 2015. His career in government has spanned nearly 25 years, beginning under President Clinton, where he was member of the President's National Security Council staff, including as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European Affairs, which is the President's principal advisor for relations with countries of Europe, European Union, and NATO. Tony is also a contributing opinion writer for New York Times and a global affairs analyst for CNN. I want to add that Tony is the recipient of the law school's most distinguished alumni honor, a Medal for Excellence, which he received in 2016. Tony, congratulations on your 30th reunion, and welcome back to Columbia. With that, I'd like to welcome Dean Gillian Lester and Tony Blinken, class of '88, to the stage.
That's right.
Thank you, Ryan, for that nice introduction. Welcome, all of you. It is, I have to say, a beautiful day for a reunion here in New York, and it's wonderful to see so many faces from far and wide. Before Tony and I begin our conversation, I'm going to just add a few more shout-outs and expressions of enthusiasm about the success of this reunion, and then I will move quickly through those accolades, it turns out, and I'm really looking forward to digging into our conversation. So we're welcoming back more than 1,300 alumni today. That's a record. We've never had that many come to a reunion, and it's 20% more than this group had in attendance at your reunion 5 years ago. So that's really wonderful. And then several of the classes are breaking records for reunion attendance by that class year. So the 2013, 2003, 1988, and 1958 have broken attendance records for the 5th, 10th, 30th, and momentous 60th reunion years. So I just want to say that that's fabulous. And then as Ryan anticipated, partly when he was talking about the success of this year's reunion, $12 million have been raised by the reunion. surpassing your last reunion by 33%. I want to thank all of those who've led that wonderful effort. It's a tremendous support to the school. And a special shout out to the classes of 1983 and 1968. The class of 1983, the 35th reunion class, raised a record $5.1 million, which is not only a record for a 35th reunion, but it's also the most raised by a reunion class ever. So that's really tremendous. And the class of '68, I'm honoring for the highest participation giving rate of any class at all. So welcome to all of you from more than 30 countries, and thank you to all of you for your robust participation. I'm excited to have you here, and I'm very, very excited to begin. So, Tony Blinken, class of 1988, you are a man of tremendous accomplishment from two very senior posts in presidential administrations, most recently Deputy Secretary of State from 2015 to 2017, and before that, also under President Obama, the Deputy National Security Advisor from 2013 to 2015. But those have been capstones in a 20-year career. These were culminating posts that you held following a progression of senior policy positions in foreign policy, not to mention a couple of books written along the way, and really a long career playing a guiding hand in critical positions in our nation's foreign policy during challenging times. Currently, absolutely continuing to lead with your voice, offering trenchant analysis through your work as leader of the Penn Biden Center of Diplomacy and Global Engagement, as well as in media outlets. I read what you have to say first. And I'm immensely proud to be sharing the stage with you. So thank you for coming here from DC and celebrating your reunion with us and sharing your thoughts with us. So why don't I kick it off by inviting you to tell us a little bit about your career path. And of course, here we all are at Columbia Law School. You were class of '88. What things you can connect to the education you had while you were here at Columbia Law School?
Well, Gillian, thanks. And thanks for those very wonderful and warm words. It's wonderful to be back here. Actually, I'm not used to sitting on this side in the frame. You're very, very kind to mention, you said books, plural. Actually, it's only one book. It's still available on Amazon. It's called Ally versus Ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis. Actually, in part, I finished it while I was here. But for anyone who wants to look it up, I should warn you that the only reviewer said it's the kind of book that once put down is very hard to pick up again. So fair warning to anyone who looks for it. You know, I suspect, like a lot of classmates and friends and others in this room, I actually had a pretty serendipitous path that took me eventually into government and into public service. At the very end of my time at Columbia, third year, when admittedly there was a little bit more flexibility to do different things, I wound up working in New York on the campaign of someone that some of you will remember, Michael Dukakis. He was the Democratic nominee for president in 1988. And at the end of the year, after graduation, wound up on the campaign full-time, moved to Boston, did that. That didn't end so well, and finally took the bar after that. And then came back to New York and worked for one of the most wonderful firms in New York. But I have to say, it turned out that it really wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. My law career in private practice lasted 1 year, 10 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, and 5 hours. But I have to say, time nonetheless well spent, because just as being here and spending 3 years at Columbia gave me an extraordinary foundation for ultimately being able to work in public service and in government. Spending even just a couple of years at a law firm was kind of a finishing school that really did make a lot of sense. And then a lot of serendipity. I wound up doing journalism for a while, was in the film production business, very unsuccessfully, although it was a heck of a lot of fun. for a couple of years. And then again, through total serendipity, wound up in the Clinton administration, really through a college friend who knew someone brought me in. The guy who hired me to work in the Clinton administration is a wonderful man named Steve Oxman. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. And Steve was looking to bring in a special assistant, as many senior officials do in administrations. And he had two criteria. One, a law degree. He was a lawyer. He thought lawyers were good at basically doing one thing that he was focused on, which was problem solving. And he wanted someone with an international background. And I was able to go to him with, happily, this law degree in hand, but also something else that Columbia really brought out, which was the international dimension of things. A lot of my friends, of course, were LLMs. The fact that I was able to do things at just down the hall at SEPA made a difference, including a couple of classes that caught his attention. And then I think the faculty itself was just very well versed in matters beyond the borders of the United States. So all of that proved very appealing. And long story short, after many years of trying all these different things, I wound up in government and found out that's what I really like to do. And almost 25 years later, that's over, but it was an incredibly wonderful ride. And a lot of what I learned here, especially just figuring out how to approach problems, is really at the heart of what you do in government. And the other thing that was so powerful here, and in retrospect, I wish I had done more of this. I think the wonderful thing about law school that we probably all actually get away from, unfortunately, because we do get caught up a little bit in the paper chase and getting a good job, is that it really is everything about the foundations of our country, of our system, of our history. And if you can even take a little piece of that away with you, it's a very, very powerful thing and a very strong foundation, especially if you want to get into government and public service.
Do you have any just fun facts? Most of us in the room, if you just take a moment to think, can remember some moment in law school. I remember the first time I was called on. So I'm gonna ask you to just give us a snapshot of a memory you have from law school where you were mortified or transformed or something happened that never left you.
Well, I think I had an almost panic attack coming back into this room because I'm trying to remember if it was some variation of this room. And I don't know if any of my classmates are here who were actually in civil procedure with me that first day of the first year. Hans Smit. Many of you remember Professor Smit. He was a rather intimidating figure, just physically. Tall, bald, strong, and he played up the intimidation. Of course, if you got to know him, he was an absolutely wonderful man and wonderful teacher. But the very first day, the very first class, and everyone, as you'll all remember so well, you're in here, you're just incredibly nervous to begin with. And he's looking around, and we've all done our reading religiously for that first class. And by the way, I think everyone probably remembers this too. You're kind of overwhelmed at the extent of the reading that goes into just preparing for one class. And he asks a question, and he calls on one of our classmates. And everyone is just holding their breath, waiting to see what will happen. And she fumbles a little bit with the notes and stands up and is about to give an answer to this question. And just as she's about to launch into her answer, Professor Smit says, "Wait, stop. Before you answer, there's one thing you must know. No matter what you answer, you'll be wrong." Welcome to Columbia Law School.
Yeah, it turns out that there are quite a few people where Professor Smit is at the heart of their mortifying moment in law school. So you talked about problem solving, communication as being, you talked about fundamentals. We here, I as dean, think about what we can do to train people to be leaders of the next generation and follow in footsteps as distinguished as your footsteps. When you think about people, young people who come into your realm, particularly those who come from legal training, can you think of things that we might be teaching that you had to learn on the street, or things that you can highlight, classes, or particular skills you learned when you were here that you really think we need to continue to amplify?
There are a few things that really stand out, and some of this you learn the hard way, and some of it you just pick up through experience. And I'd say the things that stand out that I've seen in my colleagues in government that have made them effective public servants, and when I was looking to hire people later in my career in government, the things that I looked for did bring me back to some of the very foundational things that I got here at Columbia. And we've talked a little bit about this, and I know, and I'm actually curious to hear from you, because I think there's actually been an evolution, if not a revolution, in some of the teaching that goes on here that actually amplifies some of those things. But I'd say a few things. One is, look, the basics. It really is, so much of what we do is about problem solving. And having a construct that you get, in part just from going to law school, but even more so going to Columbia Law School, and how to think about and approach a problem makes a huge difference. When it's come to hiring, either when I've been on the receiving end of being hired or when I've been in the position of hiring people, my general tendency has been to look for folks who are not necessarily the world's leading expert on issue X, Y, or Z, but who just have a very strong foundation in figuring out how to approach a problem and how to solve it. So those skills are really at the heart of everything. Second, and this seems obvious, but I suspect many of you have found the same thing in different places. I'm constantly struck by how even some of the smartest people I've met and know aren't quite as good at communicating what they know, either speaking it or writing it. And in government, as in most things, that's really the lifeblood of what you do and how you can be effective. So here, whether it was doing moot court, whether it was doing some of the writing programs, it makes a huge difference. Getting that down early. Hopefully you've gotten that even before you get to Columbia. But if not, it's vital. But then there are things that are a little bit more amorphous, but they're really critical. And again, it's probably obvious in any organization, but no more so than in government. One is figuring out how to work as a team and collaborate. That's the essence of government, at least if you're going to do it right. And again, you can be the smartest, most proficient individual, but if you can't figure out how to work and collaborate with others, you're not going to be as effective. And there too, I mean, one of the things that I enjoyed, particularly at the end of my Columbia career, were the clinical programs where you really did focus on that. And then finally, I guess one of the things that really stands out is management. Management up, but also management down. Knowing how to operate in an organization where you're reporting to someone, working for someone, you're not necessarily at the table, but that someone is, and you have to make sure they're as well prepared as possible. That's hugely important. Parenthetically, at one point in my career, I worked for Joe Biden in the Senate, and I was hired to be the staff director for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And on my first day, someone pulled me aside and said, you know, there are 2 words in your title of staff director. Only one of them counts. It's not director. So in government, one of the things you learn is being staff is actually something you take pride in. Being a good staffer, being able to manage up in that way, hugely important. But I've got to tell you, to me, even more important than any of that, as you progress in your career, hopefully, managing down is even more important. One of the things that I take pride in is having some ability, I think, to manage down. When we hire people in government, we of course ask the people they work for what they were like, but I'm much more focused on the people who worked for them and what it was like. And there have been a couple of cases where people who seemed incredible on paper and got great reviews from the people they worked for didn't get such good reviews from the people who worked for them, and that was the end of that. Yeah. But tell me a little bit, Gillian, because I know there's been a lot going on here that's actually looking again at those very foundational things that make a difference in whatever you do, whether you're in the private sector, public sector, whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear you talk, because we've been trying to build new things on top of the great core foundations of a rigorous doctrinal foundation that Columbia is so well known for. Couple of things. I'll mention 3 things we're doing that I think speak to some of the skills that you're describing. So one piece of it, you were talking about problem solving. And obviously you learn through the traditional Socratic method how to do the legal analytic method, how to look on the one hand, on the other hand. But the thing that people find they need to, all of you who've supervised and done legal work, working with clients often just need to know, so I understand there's a one hand and there's another hand, but at some point you got to make a call. So how do we train people to have judgment in problem solving? So one of the things that we've been amplifying and building at the school is our experiential learning curriculum. So clinics, field placements, simulation classes in which the students take what they're learning in the classroom through the textbooks, and then they're put in either simulated or real problem-solving situations with simulated or real clients. And they have to make judgments. They have to start exercising those muscles that are going to become, not just in simulated situations, but in high-stakes situations in many cases, that are going to become vital once they become lawyers. And so experiential learning has been one piece of what we've been amplifying. We're trying to double the number of seats in our clinics over the next 5 years as part of our campaign, and that's been really an important part of the foundation of that growth of experiential learning. But we've also hired a new director for field placements, and we're branching out throughout the city and offering Columbia Skills and Talents to a number of organizations, public and public interest, and that's a way for students to get those skills. A second thing is a leadership initiative. Davis Polk gave us a wonderful gift that's allowed us to launch an initiative to teach leadership. So business schools have been doing it for years, but law schools haven't seen that as part of what they do. But hearing you talk about your career, talking about working collaboratively, managing up, managing down, learning how to do, there's communication in general, but there's also strategic communication, communication to teams, communication about giving people feedback and asking for feedback. Communication has many modalities that are important, not just legal advocacy. And leadership, our leadership initiative is going to be, we've built a whole new course module, we've built something in our orientation, and it's an exciting moment for the school in very explicitly teaching students to learn leadership alongside their law degree. And then thirdly, a third thing I'll comment on is we've been really building on, and you didn't mention this, Tony, but Columbia is a school that's been justly famous for being a school that trains people to be global actors,
yes,
and you are,
absolutely.
You're a shining model for that, a product of it, but well beyond that, a shining model for that. And it's important that we continue to be a school that has a global reach, a global footprint. And one thing I'll comment on, there's so much I could say about that, but we've expanded the number of advocacy competitions that we enter into. A couple of years ago, we won the Jessup Moot internationally. Best brief, best oralist, 650 teams competing.
Wow.
But now we have something like 6 or 7 advocacy teams that go around the world. There's an international intellectual property one, there's the national security team that goes to Washington. And so we do some fantastic work in teaching communication in the classic advocacy sense to people who might go on to become global players like you've been. But so let's come back to some of your thoughts about the world around us. I guess I want to ask you. So these are turbulent times, and I'm curious to know. Many of us have read your editorials. You offer analysis on particular issues in a way, as I said, that's very trenchant. But what things are your biggest concerns when you think about the world today from the perspective of your expertise?
Well, and first let me say, by the way, what you just outlined is incredibly, not just impressive, but it's also, I think, energizing to hear about that, to hear what's actually happening here. And it's also comforting to know that the next generation of folks who are going to play roles across the board, but including in the public sector, in public policy, will be so well trained. So that's terrific. I get asked a lot these days where I kind of fall on the spectrum of hope to despair about the world that we're living in. And I've decided that I'm somewhere in between Alfred E. Newman and John McCain. Alfred E. Newman, some of you will remember, was the quote-unquote publisher of something called Mad Magazine when I was a kid. Some of you will remember that. And his motto as publisher, the publisher's motto was, what, me worry? So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is John McCain, and it's appropriate to have a thought for Senator McCain as we gather here today. And he has said famously that it is always darkest before it goes completely black. So I guess I put myself somewhere in between the two of them. Look, you know, Gillian, we were talking about this a little bit the other day, and I've tried to step back since I've been out of government for the last year and a half. I've tried to step back to make sense of this moment. And the best I can do is this. It seems to me that as we look at what divides us here in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, especially in Europe, what's so palpable and powerful is that the dividing line that's really emerged is not a dividing line between left and right, between Republicans and Democrats, between liberals and conservatives. The dividing line that I've seen emerge in sharper and sharper relief over the last few years is really one between those of us who, confronted with these incredibly complex challenges and change that we see around the world, think that the best answer is to kind of hunker down, to play defense, to protect ourselves, versus those of us who believe that our best bet is actually to somehow stay open and connected, and then to do what we can to shape these forces of change in ways that benefit us, or at least to mitigate the downsides. In other words, if you were going to put an image to it, it's the difference between those who believe that our future is best assured by building walls, and those who believe, no, it's better assured by trying to keep building bridges. And I think as I was thinking about this, it seems to me that we've kind of arrived at this moment as the culmination of three big trends that I at least saw develop over the last couple of decades in government. One, and a lot of this is pretty obvious, but sometimes you don't see it when it's happening in real time, and it takes a little bit of a step back to sort of figure it out. One is simply the extraordinarily rapid pace of technological change, combined with an onslaught, an inundation of information that we're all on the receiving end of, and this sense of an erosion of borders, because technology has all brought us closer together in so many ways. That, for a lot of people, has created a growing sense of chaos and confusion and vulnerability, not knowing how things work, not understanding how to make sense of the world that we're living in. So you've got that. Second, there's this paradox that we've seen emerge. On the one hand, in the aggregate, if we all step back, we'd probably reasonably conclude that we've never been wealthier, healthier, wiser, more secure, or more tolerant in our history, as Steven Pinker and others have written about so eloquently. And yet, obviously, at the same time, huge numbers of people feel left out or left behind from all of that progress, either culturally or economically. And the 2008 financial crisis exacerbated that. So then you've got big pockets of people who have anger, fear, resentment, added to this other sense of chaos and confusion and vulnerability that comes from just the rapid pace of change. And finally this, huge shifts in power dynamics, not just among countries, although that's very, very palpable, whether it's the rise of China and others, but especially beyond them, below them. All of a sudden, the mayor of a megacity, like New York, a corporate chieftain, some kind of super empowered group or individuals, they, powered by technology and information, have the ability to basically veto the outcomes that traditional sources of decision making, a national government or an international institution, used to have. That makes it harder for those traditional sources of authority to actually get the job done, to deliver what people are looking for. And that fuels a crisis of legitimacy and credibility and confidence in those institutions. You put all of that together, and you kind of have a perfect storm moment. And of course, we've been there in the past. It's not something new. We've had moments like this before. But in these moments, strong leaders who speak strongly and have simple solutions to these problems tend to rise to the fore. And then the forces of nationalism, populism, xenophobia, unilateralism also rise to the fore. So to me, that's a little bit the moment we're in. And as someone who's very much on the bridge building side, I think there's a special obligation right now, not only to defend that proposition and why it's actually been beneficial over the last 70 plus years that the United States has been in the business of leading the world in building bridges, not just to defend it, but actually to amend it, to figure out how to make it work better for more people. Because if we don't, then the legitimacy of the entire enterprise risks collapsing. So to me, to sum up, I'm thinking about this moment that we're in a little bit like the dawn of the progressive era. Then we had capitalism fully unleashed on this country, producing extraordinary wealth and progress, but of course also with a lot of rough edges and leaving a lot of people out and running the risk of creating a counter-reaction to the system that would destroy it. And we had a progressive era, we later had a New Deal, and at least in my judgment, those things actually saved the system from its own destruction. I think we need something similar now, but, and here's where Columbia comes in again, not just on a national scale, but on a global scale. That's the challenge of the moment.
You know, I think a lot about this next generation that's entering into the world, and many of us here have children, grandchildren. Mm-hmm. I have, 1,500 students in the building in any given year who are going, they're at a juncture in their lives when they're entering into this complex world. And, I want to give them words and inspiration and hope as they leave Columbia Law School, to see themselves as part of this next, a brighter future.
Yeah.
If you were advising, this group of 1,500 students who walked across the graduation stage each year, actually it's about 750 each year, what do you tell them about entering in a world where there's a lot of cynicism about fake news, about polarization?
I tell them a couple of things. First, I'd say anything is possible. The Washington Capitals just won the Stanley Cup, so anything is possible. As a Washingtonian of 25 years, that's a big deal. Washington has not won a major sports championship since 1992, until 2 days ago. So if that can happen, anything can happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
But look, in all seriousness, a few things. First, and I suspect many of you have had the same experience. I have to tell you, I'm in awe of this generation of students. First of all, I suspect that if I was applying to Columbia Law School today, I wouldn't get in. And maybe a few of you feel the same way. You look at the accomplishments of folks who are still so young but have done so much. But also, I think what we're seeing more and more is a strong desire to make a difference in whatever path they choose. And we've seen that manifest itself in so many different ways around the country in the last few years. And I hope that really is something that's a defining characteristic of this rising generation. So one, you've got a cohort of people who have an amazing foundation, and then if they're fortunate enough and have worked hard enough to get into a place like Columbia, they're going to be very well served. They're going to have the ability, the capacity to really be effective actors in this world. So that's one thing that I think is immensely important. The other thing, though, is this, and again, I think this is another place that I think Columbia comes in. I was usually fortunate, and some of you who are in public service may or may not have had this experience. When I got out of school, I didn't actually have any debts to pay off. I had extraordinary parents who provided for my education. And that gave me the freedom to be able to pursue a career in public policy and in the public sector. One of the things that was frustrating, though, is I had a lot of colleagues and friends back then, some of whom wanted to do the same thing, but just couldn't. And they may have gone on to have terrific careers in the private sector. Some of them later made enough money so that they could actually go into public service. But one of the things that I know we've talked about a little bit, but that I've been impressed by too, and this is where I think it's so important that people know this. You also have a program and a system here that makes it a lot easier for people who are not as fortunate to make that kind of choice, to make that kind of career path. So they have the skills, they have the drive and the determination to make a difference. They actually have the ability to do that through some of the things you're doing, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that. But the final thing is this. My takeaway from 25 years in Washington, despite all of the cynicism that you alluded to, is 9 out of 10 people that I worked with over those 25 years, whether they were Republicans, Democrats, or something in between, or something else, were all there for basically the same reason. They wanted to do the right thing by the country, and we simply would disagree occasionally about what doing the right thing meant, but we all had the same goal. And I feel that very, very strongly today. It's still the same. Most of the folks I come across every day feel very much the same way. One quick anecdote, and I do want to hear about the support that you're giving to folks who are choosing these kind of careers. I'll mention Joe Biden again. I started to work for him in 2002 and on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And that was the year that 2 senators, Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond, were retiring. And I began working for Biden in the spring of that year, and they were retiring in the winter after the midterm elections. And in the fall, Biden held a party, a reception for them. I thought, that's pretty extraordinary, because here you've got a guy like Biden, who's kind of a liberal lion and icon, and Senator Helms, Senator Thurmond, very much on the other side of the spectrum. But I went to the party, and I watched the visible warmth that these 3 had, who could not have disagreed more on virtually every issue that came before them. Yet they liked each other, they respected each other, they worked together, and they actually got a few things done. And then when Senator Thurmond passed away, he asked in his will that Biden deliver the eulogy, which was truly extraordinary. And when Senator Helms a few years later opened the Jesse Helms Center at the University of North Carolina, he asked Biden to deliver the opening address. Those were the kind of relationships that I saw, even with all of the Sturm und Drang of Washington, that still underpinned a lot of what went on. So on a less happy note, that's less the case. I hope we can find a way, and maybe the genie's out of the bottle, it's impossible to I hope we can find a way to get back to it. But my takeaway, Gillian, is that most of the people that I've worked with over 25 years, all were there for good reasons, wanting to do the right thing. And yes, let's disagree about what doing the right thing means, but let's question judgments. But if we can somehow get away from where we are, which is questioning motives, that would be a really good thing.
You know, I think that you spoke to something a moment ago. I think that what we're seeing in the waves of students who are coming back to law school, we had a dip in law school applications after the financial, after around 2010. People are coming back to law school, and what we're feeling is that they're coming back to law school with vision about making a contribution to society. I think they see the world around us, and they see the role of law, the rule of law, and the role of the rule of law, and they want to be part of that project. So you're right, that in order to bring students through, it's expensive to provide a great legal education in the city of New York. And in order to bring students through Columbia and give them a full set of choices as they leave, I've been really doubling down on financial aid, increased financial aid by 40% since coming in as dean. And then we have this fabulous loan repayment assistance program, which is one of the most generous in the country, where a student goes into public service or public interest work. For a decade after they leave the school, we'll just pay their student, send us the bill. We pay their student loan payment. If they go on to earn more money, then they graduate out of it. But if they're going and working in a government job, or they're working in a public interest job where they're not making a lot of money, it's great. We had a gala launch to our campaign last fall, and Governor Steve Bullock of Montana came, and he spoke to the fact that there was a period of time after he left law firm practice to go back to Montana to care for his father, who had a terminal illness. He decided he wanted to do something more meaningful to him, and that was to go into becoming a public prosecutor. And how was he going to afford that? And it was right around the time that we started our loan repayment assistance program. And so he came to the law school to get counseling, and he learned about the program. And the program helped him to be able to go do this work, and obviously it led to great things. So we're very proud of the ability we've built over time through financial aid to enable students to enter into these kinds of career paths. Listen, I'm sure people have questions for you, so let's open this up and hear what our audience members have to say. So if you push the button on the mic in front of you, that'll turn it on.
Truth is getting beaten up in the 21st century or in the 2018. What is the law school doing to sort of reinvigorate truth? And then what other comments can you make on sort of where truth is in the world?
Well, so I think we should both answer this question. I'll talk about what the law school's doing, and then just thinking about reinvigorating truth more generally. I'll comment that sometimes it's about creating opportunities for our students to have challenging conversations with one another. And I've tried to do that in a variety of ways as dean. I created something called Lawyers, Community, and Impact shortly after I came in as dean. And what I wanted to do through that was have students be discussing outside the classroom the things going on in the world around us that affected the path of society, and to connect it to what they were learning in the classroom. And often we'll bring professors, and professors will talk about the way their work connects with the things in the world around them rather than just what's in the casebook. And it gives opportunities to students to hear about policing or tax reform or housing and the anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and how what they're learning ties in with these current events. And of course, the election was the subject of much conversation in the classroom, both leading into it and after. So, and at my commencement address just a couple of weeks ago, I talked about polarization in public discourse. And I compared it to polarization 50 years ago when the class of 1968 took over the administration here at Columbia. And I asked our students to draw lessons from the power of finding ways, especially as lawyers, especially as people who are trained to think about legal institutions and public institutions, to use the power of language, to use their power of as architects of public institutions, to build past polarized discourse, and to be the grown-ups in the room. Tony, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
No, look, I think what you're doing is terrific, and more vital than ever. I have to tell you, of all the things that I see going on around us, this truth decay is the thing that is the single most corrosive of our democracy. And if anything keeps me up at night, it's that. And look, this is not a political forum, so I'm going to shy away from politics, except to say that this really should be top down. The rule of law, objectivity, the importance of facts. That's what we should be hearing from our leaders, including from our president. And we all have founding mythologies. One of the founding mythologies we have is George Washington and the cherry tree. And I think tragically, we have gone from a first president of the United States who couldn't tell a lie to one who fill in the blank. And so if it's not going to be top down, it has to be bottom up. And that means law schools and colleges. I hope it means also the private sector and corporations, NGOs. It really has to be there and done in a systematic and powerful way. And then hopefully this generation that you're now nurturing and sending out into the world will have that basic approach to thinking about problems. But I've got to say, it is the single most frightening thing that I'm seeing around us right now.
Yes.
So it's more of a comment and a question. We discussed, and it's well recognized, that the world today we are living in is constantly changing, and the pace of change is just accelerating. So to put your analogy of building a bridge in other words, it's ability to adapt to change, which is critical. And for any educational institution, now the system of education as imparting a body of knowledge to students which pre-existed on an assumption that what helped in the past is going to help in the future is not going to work anymore. If we shift the focus from body of knowledge as a factual information overload to ability to learn and ability to adapt, right? How new challenges will be coming up. So it's more from knowledge to skill set building, and their educational institutions have a large role to play. So I'm hopeful that Columbia is also taking initiatives in that direction, where the focus is more on building skill sets and building ability to adapt, deal with any situation, and not just focusing on existing body of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I agree. I think it has to be both. And I think what was already happening in Columbia when I was here, but now seems to be on steroids, is exactly what you're talking about, which is this ability to adapt, to deal with changing circumstances, to prepare people to do that. But I've got to say the body of knowledge is kind of important too. And you know, as I said earlier, I think what was so powerful here, and with a legal education in general, is this foundation that you get in the history of our own country, its system, legal, governance, etc. And the bottom line is that those who forget history are condemned to retweet it. And that's something we have to be aware of too. So the body of knowledge is important, even as you figure out how to adapt to changing circumstances.
Yeah, I just want to affirm both as well. You know, one of the things that makes Columbia a very special place is we have the greatest minds in the country on our faculty. We have a community that includes as well alumni who have developed skills in doing the work they do at the very highest levels, some of whom come back and teach those courses that help us to build skills. And then we have people who are both faculty who have great minds and are our clinical professors who are teaching skills. But we never want to lose sight of the fact that a Columbia Law degree is going to open many doors for our graduates. And they'll be put in a position where they are being asked to counsel, to guide, to advise in some of the ways that Tony has been. And so being able to be very thoughtful in thinking right from theory up about how to think in new ways that challenge orthodoxies, that push the world forward, that devise new ways of solving legal problems, but also confronting the most difficult policy challenges of our time. Part of that comes from being around the kinds of creative, rigorous intellectual minds that our faculty is so lucky to have as part of it and has been part of our legacy. And then, we always need to be thinking about what's the cutting edge of skill building. So just as an example, I don't know how many of you were here for the first panel today, but it was about technology. You know, we've attracted to Columbia in the last couple of years 4 or 5 faculty members who are thinking about digital law. They're thinking about how technology intersects with the law. They themselves are skilled at doing work that involves manipulating big data or thinking about how lawyers can use technology. I'm just giving that as one example of a cutting edge type of skill. Another second example I'll give of a skill that I don't think was historically incorporated in the same way into law school, but that is a very powerful tool that I think ties some threads in our conversation is journalism, is interdisciplinarity more generally. Having our students know some business skills, for example, having them take courses in SEPA like Tony did when he was here at law school. But we've built something recently which is even more ties to the journalism school. Communication about vital issues in our society matters a lot, and how you communicate it and how you ethically communicate it matters a great deal. We've launched the Knight First Amendment Institute this past year, and we have many students who are studying both journalism and law. I just wanted to give that as an example of a kind of skill that's now becoming more available to our students because of interdisciplinary ties. That can allow them to leverage the theoretical and very, very challenging, original, rigorous work that they're being exposed to, that our faculty does year in and year out.
And leadership is another one that you just mentioned. That's another
Yeah.
skill set that Columbia is developing then.
Yes.
I'm Bob Rosenbaum, class of '68. I'm delighted to hear of your interest in public interest as a career path for graduates. When I graduated, I think a huge percentage, maybe 85, 95%, went into the private practice of law. I have thought, and I did too, and I spent 50 years practicing in a law firm. But I hope that more of the recent graduates go into public interest law, either directly from law school or pro bono work while they're in law firms, which is what I did, or after paying their tuition loans, going into public interest field afterwards. I'm wondering if you track your graduates to see how many are using these opportunities that you're now giving, such as forgiveness of debt, to encourage people, but also to get a real life feedback on how successful you are being in promoting public interest area, because I think, of course, today, for all the reasons you've discussed, it's so critical that the minds developed at Columbia Law School help to move our country in the right direction.
It's a great point that you make, and we have been starting to collect data to be able to do exactly what you're describing, to track what the path is that our graduates take, and then to try to connect the threads back to what opportunities they took advantage of while they were here at Columbia Law School. One of the things that's been most interesting, and our data are still preliminary, and so I can't, we're collecting and we'll start looking. But one of the things that's interesting is when students graduate from Columbia, it continues to be the case that a strong majority of them go into private practice. And Tony was mentioning that practicing law for some period of time is finishing school in many ways. Some go into public or public interest practice as well, but almost everybody practices immediately. But one of the things that we see is that there's a group that starts out in private practice, and then if you look 5 years out and you look 10 years out, there are some that then move into public service or public interest work over time. And then there's also a group that moves into business over time. And that's, I think, a really interesting thing to see, because it suggests that what we as Columbia should and can be doing is maintaining our ties to our graduates, to be continuing to provide support so that our career services office, for example, does not see itself as having its only constituency being the students in the building, but people who are making transitions 5 years, 10 years out. And the way we counsel people, don't throw all in. If you think now that you might want to have a multiphasal career, plan for that and give it your all, but don't build a life around this particular vision of private practice. If what you really would like to be doing at some point is going into public service, think about how you're going to lay those foundations. And we can counsel our students in that way. So, yeah. One more question, and then we will wrap up.
It'll be short. I guess I'm class of '93. I guess I'm getting a little sentimental being back here. And one question for the dean and one question for Tony. The question for the dean would be, if I want to get more involved, I want to hang out at the library some. I live in Manhattan. I think I have some skills, and I want to give back, not just in money, but in involvement too. Is there ways that I can do that for you? And for you, Tony, would be, you were talking about bridges and walls and stepping back a little bit and seeing some of the macro things that are happening, which is great, but I get the feeling that some people in our government right now are capitalizing on on the fear, anxiety right now, do they know about, or do they see the forest from the trees? And will they respond to it, or are they just taking advantage right now and want to take that to the hilt? Okay, that's my question to both.
So let me give a brief answer, and then leave most of the remaining time for Tony to close. We have a big part of our time we devote to alumni relations, and I want to really make a point and emphasize a point that it's not just about development. It's not about fundraising is an important part of what we do through our alumni relations team and the interactions we have with alumni. But when I was celebrating this reunion, I led with participation. And that's how it begins. It begins by coming to something that, an event that's at the school or a reunion. You start to have more conversations. You learn what's going on in the school. And we also know that you're out there in the world. And so when a student group, for example, says, we want to do a conference on, immigration, it'd be great to be able to include some alumni in the invitation list. It'd be great to know about some of our alumni who we would be able to invite as speakers. Our alumni team can say, great. And they do this all the time. They say, great. And they look at who's in our orbit, who we've maintained ties with. And so we try to do everything we can to build those ties so that when those opportunities arise, we can issue an invitation or put a student group in touch with alumni. So, and they are so inspired by meeting alumni. They think, you were sitting where, 15 years ago, you were sitting where I'm sitting now. And there's nothing more they want than to learn about what path you've taken and have you as an aspiration, have what you've done as an aspiration. So thank you for being here and continue to be here. So Tony.
Come on down, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me conclude with this, and I think it actually kind of marries the question and comment we had about the role of teaching skills to deal with a cutting edge, in a cutting edge way with change, but also having some kind of foundational knowledge that you're applying to that. Look, I think there are a lot of folks who may be moving things in one direction who profoundly, genuinely believe it's the right thing to do. And this is where we should get into a real discussion about judgment. And this is where history comes in, which I'll come to in 1 second. But there are always maybe a smaller number of people who are seizing on an opportunity to either get power or consolidate it. And it works in both directions in that way. But for those who think that this is the right direction, and this is again where at least to me, the history piece comes in, history has a way of repeating itself in somewhat different manifestations. And the moment that we're in now is in many ways, as I said, not dissimilar, I think, to where we were before the Progressive Era, but it's also not dissimilar to the period between World War I and World War II, and then the period after World War II, by which I mean this. After World War I, we decided to come home. And that was understandable, and after the contributions and sacrifices we'd made. But ultimately it led to some decisions, staying out of the League of Nations, deciding when we saw economic dislocation rising, particularly in Europe, to become protectionist in our own policies, to protect ourselves. Seeing the emergence of dictators and deciding, no, let's stay out of that, and becoming isolationist, all of which were tendencies and trends in American history in any event, but that came to the fore. And then we wound up with a global conflagration, a massive global economic crisis, and a genocide. And then after World War II, we kind of got a do-over, which is one of those things you don't often get in history. And we could have done the same thing after World War II. We could have come home, would have been a totally normal thing to do. And a lot of people obviously wanted us to do that after the sacrifice that we'd made. We didn't do that. We also could have decided to use the extraordinary power that we had after the end of World War II. We were the global power. Everyone else had suffered grievously and was in no position to really challenge us. We could have used that power to lord it over others and act unilaterally and make every decision. But we didn't do that. Ultimately, as all of you know, we devised a system in the world in which others had a voice and a vote, and we channeled our own power through the rule of international law, through institutions, through norms, and we bound ourselves, and that seemed a little bit counter-logical because we were binding ourselves to the same rules and norms as everyone else. But it had a number of salutary effects. It prevented what we've usually seen throughout history. When one country starts to emerge and rise above others, the ones below it band together and try and check its power. That didn't happen so much because we tried to work others into the system and bound ourselves to its obligations. And at the same time, we thought that actually trying to think about international relations in a new way, not a zero sum, but a win-win in which others' gains were our benefit as well, that made a huge difference. So we made significant investments in the security of other countries, in their prosperity. And what did we get? We got new markets for our products. We got new partners to deal with increasingly complex global challenges. We got new allies to hopefully deter aggression, or if we had to fight together, if that's what proved necessary. And mostly, we wound up doing what we were trying to really accomplish, which was to prevent another global conflagration. We obviously got a lot wrong in the process. There was a huge gap between the ideals that we had and the reality. Obviously, colonialism, apartheid took way too long to go away. Southeast Asia, Latin America, we were somewhat divorced from our ideals and the policies we actually pursued. Proxy wars, one kind or another, continued. But the big picture, preventing another global war, lifting and giving countries the ability to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, all of that was a massive success. And that's why I think that, and I hope, that even as we're confronting using all these new tools, these very, very different and new challenges, at the same time there is some appeal back to what we experienced before, the mistakes that we made, the wrong paths that we took, and then hopefully finding the right way forward. Because if you're both inspired by the history that we've lived and you have the tools to deal with incredibly complex change, that's a powerful combination. If you can pull those two things together, I'm convinced we get on the right course even after we try all the others first. Thanks.
Tony Blinken, class of 1988, thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks.